another episode of Verbal Weekly. This episode is called Coping with Complexity. In the previous episode, we had reduced a passage to its bones. But today, we're going to take a look at a much more complex passage. Before that, however, we have a short exercise for you to try out. Now, both the passages that we're going to use today have been provided for you to read on your own. So please look at the description and ensure that you have read the passages before you continue with the video. Let's get started. So I want you to take a look at this passage if you have not already done so and see if you can make some sense of it. Clearly, this passage is difficult to read, and one of the reasons that it is very difficult to read is because of the language. It's not a very long passage, it doesn't require too much focus, and yet somehow your mind is just not able to grapple with it. So, what exactly is the problem? First of all, the sentences are very long. So whenever you see a paragraph with very lengthy sentences, your mind is not able to separate it into different thoughts. That's one of the reasons that passages become complex. It's not the words, it's the sentence structure. But the words also matter, of course. So here we have very difficult and often unfamiliar words. Some of you with a science background may be able to decode the language, but for most of us, that's not going to be easy. So what's the solution? Well, in this case, the solution simply is to break up the long sentences so that you can look at individual ideas that have been joined together. And of course, focus on words that you do understand. I'm sure there'll be a few. And finally, in the long run, try to improve your vocabulary by reading extensively. But that is something that we're going to take up later. Let's take a look at this passage now. Now, what we are going to do is we're going to break up the same paragraph into its component ideas. We're also going to highlight words for you that you might be able to understand. Let's take a look at the first bit. A female of the species Homo sapiens was the possessor of a small, immature ruminant of the genus Ovis. So, we're clearly talking about a female, a lady or a girl. Homo sapiens, of course, is people, so we're talking about a human here, was the possessor of a small, immature ruminant. So what I would probably glean from this is that a lady or a girl owned an animal. Now this animal was immature. That could mean young, or perhaps it is a comment on the animal's personality. We don't know that yet. Let's look at the next bit. The outermost covering of which reflected all wavelengths of visible light. Now, what color reflects all wavelengths of visible light? If you can figure that out, it becomes very simple. The animal had a white coat, is what we are trying to say. Then the next part says, with a luminosity equal to the mass of naturally occurring microscopically crystalline water. Luminosity is brightness. So, was the animal glowing? Perhaps. Let's read further. Naturally occurring microscopically crystalline water. What does this really refer to? This is a very complicated way of saying snow. If you could not figure this out, I completely understand. But sometimes the author also does this. For some reason, a simple idea is stated in pretty complex language. Now, of course, you cannot change the words or the language because you're not the writer, but you can do your best to interpret it. In this case, if we have to simplify the sentence, all that we're really saying is that the coat was as bright as snow. Now, some of you may already be looking at a theme building here, but if not, we'll get there. Just hang on. Regardless of the translational pathway chosen by the Homo sapien, what does this mean? Pathway chosen by the Homo sapien. We're trying to say regardless of which way the human went or which way the lady went, because we're talking about a lady or a girl here. And finally, the probability was 1 that the aforementioned ruminant would select the same pathway. Let's look at the first part. Probability was 1. It means it was pretty certain that the ruminant is the animal mentioned earlier, would select the same path. In other words, all we're saying is that it was certain that the animal would take the same path as the human. In other words, the animal would always follow the human. So what have we done here? We've taken a pretty complex paragraph, we have separated it into parts, and we have evaluated each part independently. Now, of course, when you're reading a passage in the exam, then you may not have time to do this. But the reason that we are doing it like this in this episode is to show you how your mind needs to process information. If you cannot look at the information in totality and understand it, break it down. So, how do we further simplify it? Let's connect the dots. A girl or a lady owned an animal. The animal had a white coat and the coat was as bright as snow. Now, what is connecting the dots? A lot of times, if you are well read or you have read something similar earlier, you might be able to understand something a little more easily because of the background. In this case, all it requires is for you to be familiar with a nursery rhyme. So, what does it remind you of? Of course, we're talking about Mary who had a little lamb. So, Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow. That's all that we were trying to say. So, see how a very simple idea can be made into something very complex. But your job is to do it the other way around. Turn a complex thought into something simpler for you to understand. Let's continue. Regardless of where the human went, it was certain that the animal would take the same path. This is nothing but the next line. And everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. So here, we have tried to do two things. The first stage is simplifying the language for ourselves. The second is to be able to put it in your own words so that it's easier for you to process. Now here we have taken a pretty short paragraph, but now we're going to take a look at a somewhat longer passage. But before that, let's do a quick recap of what it takes. The moral of the story is that complex passages cannot be simplified beyond a certain point, which means that you may not be able to understand everything. And you have to be okay with that kind of ambiguity. What you do need to, however, focus on is breaking down long sentences. And further, look at the easier words and phrases that you can understand. Most of the time, we worry about the things that we don't quite get, but we forget about the stuff that we do understand, and in the end, we lose sight of the big picture. So how do you improve? You read more and read different kinds of things. How is that going to help? Well, obviously, it's going to make you a better reader. You'll be able to read faster and your vocabulary will improve. But the more important reason is that being well read allows you to connect the dots better. So in this case, if you were familiar with the nursery rhyme, then all of a sudden the meaning would become very clear to you. But if you were not familiar, then it would take a lot more effort. Improve your vocabulary through reading. So the number of words is something you can decide on, but normally I think that 5 is a good number. More importantly, if you have learned a few words today, try to use them in your conversation. It's very easy to do that. You just have to make some effort. For example, there are some new words that we learned in the paragraph that we have just read. If I wanted to use them in my conversation today, how would I do it? Let's take a look at an example. First of all, I can say, while driving on the highway, we almost bumped into a herd of ruminants. Ruminants instead of cows or buffalo. Then we could say, during our trip to Manali, we saw massive amounts of naturally occurring microscopically crystalline water, which is nothing but a very Sheldon-like way of saying snow. And finally, we have doing yoga on a regular basis makes one's skin luminous. That just means radiant, bright, or glowing. So you see how easy it is if you just make a little bit of effort. Now, you don't have to become one of those people who has to speak fancy English all the time. But using words in a conversation fixes the meaning of that word in your head. And that's why it's a very helpful technique to learn new words. Finally, we get to the core of this episode. We're going to take a look at a practice passage from CAT 2005. Now, this is one of the most challenging passages that I have seen in the exam, and it remains challenging till this day. Before you watch any further, please make sure that you read the passage on your own and try to see if you can break it down and understand the meaning. You may not be able to get everything, but focus on the bits that you do understand. And we're going to do the same for you over here on the screen. Let's get started. So paragraph 1 is going to be broken down into smaller subsets. Let's take a look at the first bit. We are talking about Derrida's work, and what are we really saying in this highlighted part? All that we're really trying to say here is that his approach, called deconstruction, sheds light on how language influences our understanding. So all we've done is that we've gotten rid of some of the difficult words and we have made the sentence a little bit easier to understand. Now let's take a look at the next bit. It's still paragraph 1. What we have highlighted here is the part that I think is important and the part that I could understand. Now here in this passage, there are of course a lot of pieces that are still a little vague to me, but I'm not going to worry about that. So what are we saying here? All that we are trying to say is that deconstruction, which is Derrida's approach, it tries to uncover hidden meanings in a text. So it's a pretty simple idea. You don't have to be able to visualize it. You don't have to think about what are these hidden meanings. All you need to do is to look at the sentence and try to figure out in your own words what is being said. Let's move on. The final bit here says, at the heart of Derrida's deconstructive approach, which means this is pretty important if we say that something is at the heart of the matter. It is a pursuit he refers to as logocentrism. So this is the bit in which we introduce a new term, which is obviously going to be important. Now we're saying that Derrida's approach critiques logocentrism. Now critique is not necessarily saying that it's bad, it's more of an evaluation. But let's read further and figure out how Derrida feels about logocentrism. Now paragraph 1 here is continued because it's a pretty long paragraph. It talks about what logocentrism is. And if I can figure it out, then I have understood this paragraph. Simplified version is that logocentrism is totalitarian. Now this is a word that may be challenging for some people. What does totalitarian mean? It means something which is a little authoritarian, a little dictatorial. It decides that certain things are right and certain things are not right. So what we are saying here is that logocentrism is totalitarian in that it dismisses all that does not adhere to its linguistic representations. Now, of course, I can simplify this sentence a little bit further. What we're probably trying to say here is that logocentrism, it dismisses or disregards anything that does not follow its rules. And that is how it's a little dictatorial. Let's continue. Now here we're saying, thus, logocentrism has in its search for the truth of absolute representation subsumed difference and oppressed that which it designates as its alien other. Now there are two words here that might be a little difficult. First of all, absolute representation. What does that mean? It's okay if I don't quite understand that phrase. I will still try to make sense of the sentence as a whole. It seems to suggest that logocentrism is oppressive. This makes sense because earlier we have said that logocentrism is a little totalitarian. So of course, it's going to be oppressive. But whom does it oppress? Well, anything that is seen as different, anything that is seen as alien. And that's all that we need to understand from this. Again, I am leaving out some phrases that are not understood, but that's okay because in your first reading, you have to simply understand the big story. Let's move further. So finally, we're at paragraph 2. Now the first bit is pretty important because this says that deconstruction in response to logocentrism, which means that perhaps this is a viewpoint that differs as compared to logocentrism. What is the difference? Well, what we're saying is that logocentrism marginalizes other perspectives. So remember earlier we had said that logocentrism is a little dictatorial. So it disregards certain other perspectives or other versions of the truth by creating a system of binary opposition. What is binary? Binary means it's a pair. So it creates a pair of opposites, and somehow creating a pair of opposites is equal to marginalizing other views. How does it do that? Let's take a look at the next bit. Now there is a lot here, but not all of it is important. So let's just focus on the explanation. So here we're trying to say that the oppositional pairs, for example, culture, nature, good, bad, these are the ordered pairs here. These are not necessarily equal, which makes sense, right? Good is good and bad is not good. So the author is trying to say that these oppositional pairs are not seen as equal. One word is seen as superior to the other, and it is usually the first word. If you really think about it, this is quite true, isn't it? We never say bad good. We always say good bad. Why do we do that? Similarly, there are a few more examples here. For example, rational, irrational. We never say irrational, rational. Why do we do that? So what this is saying is that by creating this pair of opposites, there is a hierarchy between words in which the first word is superior to the second word. Now, some of you may not really be able to see how this is going to influence our understanding of the world. But I'm sure most of you did not really look at language that way. So let's keep reading and maybe we'll learn something more. In paragraph 3, we're talking about the fact that the two terms in this paired relationship are interdependent. What is the interdependency? You see, when you try to understand one word, you are in effect also referring to the other. For example, how do we understand what is good? We understand what is good by referring to evil. So good is equal to not evil. And that's exactly what this last line here is saying. That is, to do good, we must understand that our act is not evil, because without that comparison, the term becomes meaningless. And this is a very different way of looking at the language, because there is really no other way to define good without reference to its paired opposite, which is evil. This is what Derrida refers to as binary opposition. He says that in language, there are a lot of these pairs that we have created, or that logocentrism has created, in which you can understand the meaning of one word only by referring to the other. Now, the second bit here is further explaining this process. So, thus, deconstruction seeks to reveal the interdependence of apparently dichotomous terms and their meanings relative to their textual context. It seems like a lot to process, but we have already referred to how terms are interdependent. All that we are saying here is that deconstruction, which is Derrida's approach, it tries to reveal the interdependent nature of these words. And he's further saying that whenever you read something from the point of view of deconstruction, then you have to try and reveal hidden meanings which even the author may not be aware of. And that's pretty much it. Let's look at the next paragraph. Now, in this paragraph, the first part of this paragraph, the first line is pretty clear. Meaning then is never fixed or stable, regardless of the intention of the author. How did we get to this point? See, before this, we have already established that a text may have hidden meanings because of this binary relationship between words, and even the author may not be aware of these hidden meanings. So, regardless of the intention of the author, the meaning of the text is not fixed. What does that really mean? It means that any act of interpretation should not only refer to what the author wants to convey, but should also refer to what might be absent in the author's intention. Now, this is just an extension of something we have said earlier. Remember when we were talking about good and evil, and we said that we can understand good only by referring to the absence of evil? Similarly, here when we are saying that we want to interpret another meaning, what we would have to do is not only look at what the author is communicating, but also look at what is absent in that communication. So I know that by the end of this passage, it gets pretty deep. But even if you understood 3/4 of it, then you've done a pretty good job. So after reading a very complicated passage, how do I know that I have understood it? What I would like to do is to write down the points that I can remember. This not only exercises your memory, but it also gives you a feeling that you did in fact make some sense out of it. So let's do that for this passage. The first thing that we read about was Derrida's deconstructive approach. It says that this approach helps us understand how language influences our understanding of ourselves and the world. Then we talked about the fact that the approach critiques logocentrism, which tends to be a little authoritarian or totalitarian, and it dismisses anything that does not follow its rules. The next point was that logocentrism marginalizes other views by establishing a system of binary opposition, paired opposites. The opposing words in a pair are interdependent. And then we talked about good and evil, rational, irrational. And then we said that the two words are also hierarchical, in which the first word is superior to the second word. And finally, we said that a deconstructive reading of the text tries to reveal hidden meanings in the text, which even the author may not be aware of. So that's pretty much it. If we understood this much, then that's very good. We don't have to worry about the things that we did not understand. At least that is my perspective. Till date, I can't really claim to understand 100% of this passage, but I'm pretty comfortable with that fact. Finally, what is it that we need to do from here? So this passage I have taken you through, or maybe you made a lot of progress on your own and I helped you just a little bit. Either way, from now onwards, there are certain things that you need to start doing in order to get better at this. Improve comprehension in general by breaking down paragraphs and sentences. It is an attitude and you have to actively start doing that. If you are the kind who says, I read all of it, but I don't really understand and I don't remember anything, then you're not breaking down the ideas. So please read slowly and see if you can do it. Focus on the words and phrases that you can understand. Not every word, not every sentence is equally difficult, and you have to try and focus on the big picture. It's the same thing that we tried to do in the previous episode, where we're reducing the passage to its bones. The only difference here is that here there was very little flesh and a lot more bones. So we couldn't really reduce the passage as much as we would have liked to. Of course, read diverse material so that your vocabulary improves. And of course, your focus also needs to get better in the long run, because a lot of students say that they tend to zone out when they're reading such passages. It's simply a matter of practice. And finally, have faith and practice every day, and it will definitely get better.